So welcome everyone to Curb's grant workshop. So this is the first year we're running the event. My name is Dominic. And then Cynthia is our outreach chair. She's going to be leading most of the discussion. I'm just here to introduce the event. And so it's going to be two parts. So the first part is going to be just like a panel discussion with a couple of prepared questions on slides to sort of prompt our speakers and get them talking about some of the aspects of applying for grants or funding. And then for the second portion, we're going to open it up to everybody else, and you can ask your own specific questions. Yeah, so if the speakers want to introduce themselves, we can start with Sarah and then move on from there.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I am a fourth year graduate student getting my PhD in biochemistry, cell, and molecular biology.
I can go ahead and go next. Hi, everyone. I am actually a recent grad of Cornell. I graduated in December, and I'm currently doing some research in Boston. And yeah, I'm planning on pursuing an MD PhD and planning to start this summer. So nice to meet you all.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lena. I'm currently still at Cornell. I'm a senior, fourth year, majoring in human development, and I've been doing research since freshman year.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So I'll start with the panel questions. And so the first question is, what is the general structure of a research grant?
So I think it depends kind of what you're applying for. So I had a couple that I applied for undergrad research, and the structure of those were different than grad school type grants. So typically for undergrad grant proposals, if sorry, this dog is about to throw up, so I'm just gonna, but typically for undergrad research, it's just, you know, like a statement of purpose, some details about your proposed project and why you should get the funding. But for grad school, it's a little bit more structured, in which you need like 3 specific aims, and you need kind of to show like why it's important in the field. So you have to have a discussion of what's currently known and also what you will add to the field.
Yeah, I'll concur with what Sarah said. I think it kind of depends. Even in the undergraduate range, there's, undergraduate grants, there's definitely like a range of how intense of, kind of background or a description of what you're actually planning on doing is there. I think another major part of it is definitely to be, at least in my experience, what a lot of the people in the funding for undergraduate research tend to focus on.
Okay, perfect. So we can move on to the second question. So how should I write my grant proposal so that it is appropriate for the intended audience?
So usually you can tailor them kind of to the organization that you're applying for. So specific organizations will have different like general requirements. So for example, when I was an undergrad, I applied for a couple of different fellowships that were not given by science associations. They were just given by people that want to support undergrad research. So for those, you don't really want to delve into the deep details of like your methods and your research. You want to think about like, who's going to be reading this? Is it somebody who, just wants to support science, but is not a scientist themselves? Then you want to kind of more highlight the bigger picture impacts of what like whole of knowledge your stuff is going to fill. But, when I got to grad school, I applied for an NIH grant, which had to be much more detailed. I had to lay out, everything that was known. I had to lay out exact experiments that I would do and what I expected those results to show me. And so you kind of have to think, mostly I think about your audience's background in science and to see where details you should fill in.
Yeah, I completely agree with Sarah. For most of you guys, which I infer that you guys are mostly undergraduates applying for undergraduate grants, and most of them are coming from companies or organizations that just want to support undergraduate research experiences. And so most likely they won't be like too deep in the scientific field. Most of the questions in my experience are very general, like what are your career goals, interests, and how does this experience that they possibly will be funding will fit into your career goals and interests. Other questions that are very general and very common is like, what do you hope to learn from this experience? Any skills you hope to gain, career insights. So it's kind of like your proposal will be made up mostly about why you want this experience and how it will help you.
Yeah, to kind of add on to that a little bit more, I think there's also a designation to be made whether the grant is funding you versus the grant is funding your research. I think that definitely also changes the way that you kind of want to talk about it. So as Lena was saying, like if they're funding more of like you or helping you kind of get an experience, whether like it's an unpaid internship or such, they're definitely going to want to focus more on your career goals or focus more on like you as a person versus if it's more on your specific research. Like Sarah was mentioning, then that'll definitely require you to talk a little bit more about like whether if it's in the scientific field, what kind of experiments or what kind of results, how that's kind of important to a broader audience. So I think also knowing what exactly the grant is kind of going towards is also really important.
Okay, perfect. We can move on to question 3. So what is important to consider when writing the budget portion of my grant proposal?
I guess so for this, it's you just want to make sure it's reasonable, that you're not trying to accomplish some outlandish thing. So if you're proposing something that's like very cool, very like spicy, it's going to get a lot of attention, but like is realistically going to be very, very difficult to do, chances that someone's going to give you money for that are like pretty low. You want to propose something that you could reasonably accomplish in the amount of time and with the amount of money that they're going to give you. So don't try and stretch it to like every single cent, because what if you run out because something doesn't work and you have to do it twice. So kind of thinking about a little bit of padding and being a little bit generous in there with how much you think something is going to cost, list it for just like a little bit more. And often this is really good to talk to your advisor or whoever you're doing research about or with about, because they have a much better frame of reference for what a lot of this is going to cost.
Yeah, and this also goes hand in hand with the question right before about whether or not this grant is going to fund you or your research. So if it funds your research, then I completely agree with what Sarah says. I think there's a lot more detail that goes into it about, the process of what you're gonna what you're gonna undertake and how much do you need. But if it's a grant that funds you, and then this is another area of living expenses and like rent and food and utilities, transportation. And I'm sure a lot of these grants in their applications will have these laid out. And it's in my experience when I've applied for grants that really just fund me and my living expenses, it's very easy to just put in some numbers that are very general and common in the area that you live.
Perfect. We can move on to question 4. And so how can I tailor my resume for a research grant proposal?
Okay, I'll go first again. For that, you kind of want to think about what's relevant for what you're proposing. So it's great if you have tons of experience in like, lots of things, but if you're trying to do research in a specific area, I would more highlight what experience you already have in that area, what classes have you taken in that area, make sure that your references, if it requires references, are people that are also in that area. So to just try and kind of emphasize that, but don't leave off anything that might kind of give you an interesting perspective over other people. Because, like there are, tons and tons of applicants that will have taken the general biology course if you're like, for example, applying for a biology type grant. But if you have another interesting like medical experience that you can say like, I already did this, so I'm going to bring like a little bit of a more clinical approach to this sort of thing, that's a really cool thing to highlight with your resume.
I think also for me personally, I like when I was applying for our research grants in undergrad, I didn't actually have to present my resume, but I did have to write like a biographical sketch. And they're kind of similar in the sense of what Sarah was saying. You want to talk about experiences or kind of motivations that are relevant to, if they're funding your research, even funding yourself, and goes back to like, what are your career goals? Why are you driven to do that way? Especially when it comes to funding undergraduate research work. I think people are really interested in why you're doing what you're doing and like what is motivating you. So that's another aspect to really make sure is clear.
Yeah, and I really want to highlight that there should be a connection between your resume and all of the questions that they propose in this grant proposal, whether or not it's like you're a very specific research project you want to do and you need funding for that project, or you need funding for yourself. I think that there should be some sort of connection between your resume, what experiences you have, and what experiences you're lacking, and what you want to write in that that question that you're being asked in the application.
Okay, so moving on to question 5. Why should you invest time and effort into writing a research grant proposal as an undergrad?
I mean, so I got two grants when I was an undergrad, and they really helped me get into grad school, honestly, because um, it looks really impressive on job applications and grad school applications. Any research position, if you can say, look, in the past I've had success applying for my own funding, because usually in grad school there is funding for you, but it's a big help if you also bring your own funding, because then it takes a little strain off of your boss or whatever. But um it also just like makes you look really good. So it's a really nice thing to just kind of have in your back pocket to give you a leg up when you're applying for jobs or grad school or whatever you want to do next.
I think also if people are interested in like being PIs, that's also like, a way to show that that's a necessary skill, being able to write grants, but also just more generally, like being able to communicate your research, like why you're doing it, how you're going to do it. I think all those pieces is really helpful, whether it's applying to, next steps, or even just like, personally being able to communicate those aspects, which is something you'll have to do for sure.
Perfect. We can move on to question 6, which is how should I work with my research mentors or advisors on research grant proposals?
I think for that, you never want to go to like a meeting with your mentor or advisor empty handed. You don't want to go in and say, I'm applying for this grant. What do I do? You want to go in already with some sort of draft or outline or something and be like, I'm not, sure how this is structured. This is, maybe your first time applying for a grant, but this is what I came up with. Does this seem right? Because it's a lot easier to give feedback on something that already exists than to try and be like, well, I guess like off the top of my head, you need to include these like 3 sections or something, so just showing that you put some effort in yourself before asking for help goes a long ways.
Okay, great. We can move on then to like the Q&A session. So if anyone has any questions, you can type them into the chat or unmute yourselves.
I think there's a question in the chat, right?
Okay, yeah. So the question was, is the process of finding and doing grants somewhat similar to looking for scholarships?
I'll save you, Sarah. I can go first on this one. Yeah, in some ways it is similar, and in some ways it's kind of different. I mean, essentially the idea of it is kind of the same. You're looking for funding, just maybe the purpose might be a little bit different. Generally, I would, high level recommendations is, first of all, definitely look at the college website. I think both of the grants that I applied to in undergrad were both affiliated with the university, particularly the College of Arts and Sciences, which I was a part of as an undergrad. And that was a great place to start. Usually they have a section for, research funding. The other options could definitely be like the university as a whole or even department websites. But then, beyond just like the university setting, looking for, I guess, like association specific or like field specific opportunities, I think is another way to go, another way to kind of show your interests. But that's generally how I would start.
Yeah, I also want to reiterate about the college. Looking at your college website, your department specifically, there's amazing opportunities for funding. I think Cornell is the best place to go for research and funding for research, since this is basically kind of like a research focused university. And so as a part of the human ecology department, there's so many opportunities that I've found on their website. There's never like a shortage. So it's a little bit better than finding like a scholarship, because scholarships are really hard to come by, and they're most likely by a third party organization. Whereas the colleges, they really want to see you succeed. Like your own university is there to support you.
Also, you can typically ask your advisor, because they probably know of some, because chances are you're not their first undergraduate student that's applying for a grant, and they can tell you where other students have had success before or what else they've applied for.
So there's another question by Kelly. Would it be possible to share examples of grants that the panelists have written? From my own experience as an undergrad, I've never applied for grants that are very specific to my research, but more so grants that fund me. So like, for example, the most recent grant that I've applied to is the summer experience grant, which is open to all colleges, all students at Cornell. And it was just for me to be able to stay here at Cornell, because the dorms are not a part of your tuition. And so you would have to find your own housing during the summer, kind of have to, live on your own. And so that application, the SEG application, was very kind of like held your hand throughout all of the steps. It was like few pages, and they just have a few text boxes for you to fill out. And so it wasn't really kind of like a report, or like a lab report, so to say. Yeah, like I didn't write out a lot of like paragraphs and essays for them. It was kind of like a short application, and that's all I had to do as an undergrad.
I think I personally had a kind of different experience that actually than Lena, in the sense that, so I applied for two different grants, one that was funding my research specifically, and then one that was funding me for a summer experience. And in both cases, I actually had to like write out an entire research proposal. So, I mean, I'm happy to send it out to people. I'll leave my net ID in the chat if that's helpful. But in both cases, yeah, I essentially had to write a report of some sort. So it really goes to show that there's kind of grants of all shapes and sizes, depending on, what you're exactly looking for, or what those different grants kind of require. But so for the one that was funding me, like I mentioned before, I wrote like a biographical sketch, as well as a general outline of like what I was planning on doing that summer, that they were kind of funding my living expenses for, because it's like an unpaid kind of research opportunity. And then I applied for another grant that was specifically for like funding my research while at Cornell. And that was more of just kind of talking about my project, why it was kind of important, how it was going to contribute. So I wrote an honors thesis on that work. So how that contributed to that. And I guess both were not terribly long. I think for the one that I wrote to fund my research, that was about a page long, in addition to like a budget separately. And then for the other one that kind of funded my summer experience, that ended up being, I think, close to 3 or 4 pages with references.
Yeah, so for me, my undergrad grants, I never had a grant that supported my living expenses. I only ever had grants that supported my science. But then, my boss could choose to use some of that money to pay me for my time. So it indirectly was kind of for me. But one of them, it was funded by just like a family who was an alum of the university that I went to, and they didn't really particularly care about the science I was going to do. They just wanted to know why I thought this experience would be valuable for me. So, it was an application, like a fill in the boxes type application. And then I wrote a 1-page thing about, what experience I've had so far, what I hoped to gain from this experience and how I thought that being able to do this would help me with my future goals. And then my other one was from it was like through the department website again, just like a science undergraduate supported research. So I had to write one that was basically, there was a section on background. So like what is already known in the field that you're working in. Then there was a section on like significance. So why is what I'm proposing important? What is it going to add to the field? And then I had a general methods that was kind of the outline of a quick, I'm going to do this, answer this question, do this, answer this question. And then I had to write a separate document that was the detailed methods. So explaining like what controls I was going to use, where I was going to get those strains of cells, where, what I thought was the most appropriate condition to test first. And depending on what that said, what I would do next. And so that one was far more detailed, but that was still only probably 2 or 3 pages long. So they're not terrible.
I think there was a question about how to like find a suitable grant, and is that typically like within a college?
I think you guys probably have more direct advice for that.
I think it depends. And I think, Lena, you might agree with me on this. Like, there's definitely different types of grants. You just have to spend some time on the internet and on the college websites, really just kind of searching. I would say there's kind of like 2 levels. There's definitely university level, then there's college level, then there's department level. And I think it's worth looking at all 3. I mean, I have experience in like the biology department. And so looking at the department website, particularly the Office of Undergraduate Biology has some fantastic resources. Same with the College of Arts and Sciences. So that's kind of where I found most of what I ended up using.
Yeah, I had very, very similar experience. There's like university grants, which is, it's open to all students of all colleges, like from ILR to HUMEC to CALS. And so like it's gonna fund everyone, all students who need it for the summer. And it's not that competitive for university in my experience. And then there's also some for your college, like your department. And so those are a little more extensive because they do actually care about your science and what you're doing. So those are going to be a few, like a little longer and a little more detailed. So I would suggest to, look at Cornell's website, first look at, university grants, and then go to your college and then your department. I'm sure you're going to find a wealth of knowledge on the internet. And my opinion and my advice is once you have like a grant that you actually want to apply for, there's always going to be like a contact person at the end. You can always hit them up, email them, be like, is there a time you can meet and talk about this grant? And during that meeting, you can always ask them about other grants that are also available for students like yourself who are in this specific college, because these people, these advisors know other people, know of other grants that might be of helpful to you. And that's how I found a lot of the grants that I've applied for and I've gotten.
Strongly second that advice. That's really good advice.
Yeah, networking is key here too.
Great. We have another question, which is what are the standard parts of a grant, if there is like a standard?
I think for that, again, it kind of depends what kind of grant you're applying for. So usually for scientific grants, it's what I had mentioned before, where there's a background section, a significant section, and then like a section for your plan of what you're going to do. And as you get, further along in a career in science, if that's what you want to do, it gets like a little bit more detailed than that. So for example, like the grants that I've applied for since I've been in grad school have required an AIM-1, AIM-2, and AIM-3. So those are 3 specific scientific goals that are entirely independent of each other. So like if AIM-1 fails, AIM-2 and 3 could still happen fine, so that your entire project isn't, and their funding is not tied up in one sort of like idea that has to work, and if it doesn't, like you just wasted a ton of money. So they require aims that are all well supported from the literature and planned.
I also just want to reassure everyone that I applied for my first grant my like spring of junior year. So I wouldn't worry too much about, not learning about this earlier. I think there's a lot of opportunities to like capitalize on those funding. And so, yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about it. And I think usually most grants will like spell out what exactly they want. And like Lena mentioned, like when you can set up a meeting to talk with people, and sometimes that's even required to speak with the person giving the funding. So it's kind of like a fail safe to make sure that you have everything that you need.
Yeah, and so for a little more like concrete answer, it's not very standardized, but this is like I think very common outlined of grant proposals. So for example, for College of Human Ecology, we have a very well-known summer stipend program that all students are allowed to apply for within the College of Human Ecology. For your proposal, they spell it out for you from like steps 1 to 6. Like you have your project title, you have your objectives and significance, the brief review of literature, your literature review and background, the methodology you're going to be using, the timeline and the current stage of research, and then of course at the end the budgeting and funding sources for all of the expenses other than the stipend that you're applying for. And so that's kind of like a very general outline of an undergraduate research grant that I've applied to. So yeah, I don't think I've seen other ones that go way beyond that, just because we're still undergraduates.
Sounds good. I had a question that was messaged to me asking, like, are grants supporting the student, like rather than the research, also useful in grad school applications?
I'd say yes, because you're often asked about, what research you've done. And if you haven't, it's PIs in grad school know, what it takes to support a student and what it takes to pay a student. Cause, I get paid for my time and my, work and stuff in grad school. So, being able to convince someone that the work you're doing is important enough that they should just pay you to live there is also like a really great thing.
Yeah, just to add a little bit, yeah, exactly what Sarah said. It goes to show like you're able to communicate what you've done and able to kind of talk about where you would like to take it. And it shows a lot about the way you're able to talk about your research or sell your research. So that looks good, I think, no matter what kind of next steps you plan on taking, especially in grad school.
And there was another question, what makes a grant proposal stand out from other applicants from the perspective of the reviewers?
I can take a stab at that first. I honestly think, of course, like having good logic and good reasoning about why you're doing what you're planning on doing, or a good background. But I think it really boils down to why you want to do it and why they should care about what you're doing. Because even if it's someone that is familiar with your field, they may not be familiar or an expert in your exact area of research. So being able to make sure that you can communicate the significance of your work and your personal motivators to kind of pursuing that, I've found to be like a real key to kind of help being research. And it was really cool because at the end of the day, what kind of came across was, I was excited about my research, excited where it was going and why it was meaningful. And I think to him that meant that it was worth funding.
I totally agree with that. If you can, convince people that they should care about something they've never thought about before in their life, they're going to want to fund you. They're going to be like, oh, I'm really interested to see where this goes. And even if, it's not a proposal that's about the science or the, actual research itself, and it's more about like what you need to, cover your living expenses or whatever, telling them why this experience is going to be meaningful to you is great, because people often, take experiences like, undergraduate research for granted, and they're like, well, everyone gets to do it. Why are you special? So being able to tell them that is great.
There was another question. And so when writing like a grant proposal for a project that is like already started and you're just trying to get funding for it to continue, is that different from like starting a new project?
So typically for me, when that's been the case, there's often also in in grants a place for relevant experience. So you can put in relevant experience, like, I already have experience doing these methods or doing this type of research. And look, it's already been successful and I've already discovered XYZ. So this is why you should, fund me to find these other cool questions that are related that my research already led me to. Or that, another student in your lab or your department or your, I guess I don't know what it is if it's not a lab, but if somebody else has already started some really cool work, you can be like, look, they've done all this great stuff. So we know that the tools exist to answer these questions. So now it's like time to take advantage of them.
I think as long as you convey that you've done adequate background, whether you've done that yourself or if you've done like literature review or like you have like experience in the field in whatever sort of way, as long as you can convey that, I think people are more likely to fund you because it shows that you've done your homework and you know what you're kind of walking into. So regardless of whether it's an existing project or a new project, as long as you can show that there's some basis to what you're about to do, I think that's the key point there.
There was another question. So does like writing a grant proposal differ between like different fields of study? Like for example, like in the humanities, does that look different from like writing for a bio project?
My only experience with grant writing is in the sciences, so I can't really comment on what a humanities grant would look like.
Yeah, I can't comment on it either because it's I've only ever done, studies in sciences.
I've personally also only done stuff in the sciences, but I do have a close friend that has done research in humanities and tried to get funding for that. And I think in the sense of like what you're actually writing, it ends up being kind of similar. Like you want to talk about like why it's important, show that you've done your background research. I think typically with the humanities, it tends to be a bit more on the literature review kind of heavy side versus like actually doing certain things. That being said, I have heard that in the humanities, it is a bit harder to get funding just in general for your research. So it might be a bit harder to find those opportunities, but I think from what I've heard from my close friends that have applied for humanities kind of funding, the process ends up being kind of similar if you're able to find those opportunities.
Great. I just wanted to mention before, like some people, like if they're busy with other commitments, I did include a link that was sent over to us from the Office of Undergraduate Biology of a bunch of different grant opportunities that they had. So if anyone wants to like take a picture of that or use that link, I can probably also send it out like through the campus groups email afterwards if that would be helpful.